Mr. Fukuyama, thank you a lot for your time, and I would appreciate your comments on the results of last presidential elections in USA and how it will influence the international politics and specifically changes in the landscape for the East European countries and Ukraine specifically. My first question is about the most important strategic internal and external challenges facing USA and world with revealing that high level of crisis of established political systems and political establishment in face of global changes happened.
Well, that's a very broad question. Let's just begin with Europe and Eastern Europe and Ukraine. So I think unfortunately, I think the election is very bad especially for Ukraine. And Georgia and any other country that wants to try to break free of Moscow's sphere of influence. Donald Trump, for some reason, is extremely sympathetic to Russia and to Vladimir Putin. In fact, he's so insistent on not criticizing Russia that it makes me think that there is some leverage that the Russians have on him that we don't know about. Maybe it's money that he owes Russian investors or other sorts of things, but it's very troubling. And he's made pretty clear that he wants to have a warmer relationship with Putin. The Russians are overjoyed that he was elected, and unfortunately the way you have good relations with Russia is at the expense of countries like Ukraine. So I think the immediate risk is that at the next summit in June, the United States will support the lifting of sanctions against Russia, which will lead the other Europeans to do that, so that the pressure will be off them in many respects, for what they did in not just Crimea but in eastern Ukraine. So the balance of forces there, I think, is going to shift for the worse.
When we're talking about the skepticism which Trump actually articulated about the traditional allies of United States in Europe, and specifically about the NATO, what would be the possible risks for the East European borders and especially for the Baltic countries?
Well, obviously, he said that he wasn't sure that the United States would automatically come to the defense of these treaty allies, which I think is just unprecedented. I mean, no American president has ever tried to qualify, the Article 5 guarantee that the NATO treaty has for, members of the alliance. So that's almost an open invitation for the Russians to meddle in those countries. I think that said, it would still be pretty risky for them to do that. It's one thing with Ukraine, which is not a member of NATO, but it's another thing for Estonia or any of the other Baltics where there is actually a legal guarantee. So I think again this is another area that I worry about a lot.
Then, if you will take into account all these last volatile encounters that have taken place between Russia and American NATO forces in the Baltic Sea, and this, uncertain stance of the Trump cabinet towards all the processes in which Ukraine is involved and, let's say so, intermarium countries are involved, then how likely is that Trump presidency, Trump administration will strike a deal with Putin on the removal of the USA sanctions?
Well, that's what I just said. I think it's very likely.
And then what could be the answers from the European Union?
Well, I think there's enough Europeans that want to lift sanctions already, that aren't very sympathetic, Greece and Italy and, a number of other countries. So I don't think that unless Angela Merkel can make a really impassioned case that they ought to stay,